I came home from war with 2 duffel bags, a bad knee, and a house full of dust. That was it. No welcome party. No parade. Just me, a cracked driveway, and a front door that stuck at the bottom because the wood had swollen from a winter nobody had been around to deal with. I had to kick it open with my good leg. The sound echoed through the empty hallway like a small explosion, and for a split second, every muscle in my body went rigid. Old habit. The kind that doesn't ask permission before it shows up. I stood in the doorway and looked at what 8 years away had left behind. The furniture was covered in white sheets. The floors were gray with dust. A water stain had spread across the living room ceiling like a bruise that nobody had iced. The whole house smelled like old wood and something faintly sweet that took me a moment to place. My mother used to keep little bowls of dried flowers in every room. I hadn't thought about that in years. The smell found me anyway, somewhere deep in the chest, in a place I wasn't ready to be found. I set my bags down in the hallway and didn't move for a full minute. That's the thing nobody talks about when you come back from a place like that. Everyone asks if you're okay. Nobody asks if you remember how to just stand somewhere without a reason. I had driven 14 hours straight to get to Crestfall, through flat highway and then winding back roads and finally down Ridgewood Lane, which looked smaller than I remembered it, like someone had shrunk the whole street while I was gone. The maple tree in the front yard had grown enormous though. Its highest branches scraped against the roof when the wind moved, a slow, dragging sound, like something trying to get in. I told myself I was fine. I was not fine, but I was here, and for that particular evening, here was enough. I started in the kitchen because I needed coffee more than I needed to process anything. The old percolator my father kept on the counter was still there, still plugged in, which felt both practical and deeply strange. I rinsed it out, found a can of ground coffee in the back of the cabinet that was probably 2 years old, and decided I did not care even slightly. I stood at the counter and waited for it to brew and looked out the window at the backyard. The yard was a mess, overgrown and tangled, with a rusted swing set leaning near the back fence at an angle that suggested it had been losing an argument with gravity for quite some time. I had built that swing set with my father on a Saturday when I was 7. It had seemed enormous then. Now it looked tired and small, the way most things from childhood do when you come back to them as a grown man. The coffee finished. I poured a cup and took it outside and sat on the back step. That was when I heard the footsteps. Not in the backyard. Across the street. Someone moving on a porch, then down steps, then the quiet sound of shoes crossing pavement. I came back around the side of the house without thinking, the coffee still in my hand, some old instinct moving my feet before my brain had fully caught up. She was already halfway across the street. Dark hair pulled back, wearing jeans and a deep green jacket, carrying something covered in foil with both hands. She walked the way some people do, like she had nowhere urgent to be and no interest in pretending otherwise. She looked up when she heard me come around the corner and didn't startle, didn't slow down, just kept walking until she was standing right in front of me on my own cracked driveway. She held out the dish and said it was just soup, that she had made too much, that she figured I probably hadn't had time to get groceries yet. I looked at her. She looked at me. And then, very quietly, she said, "Don't lock your door tonight, by the way."
Isterte here.
Of all the things I had been prepared to hear on my first night back in Crestfall, that was not anywhere on the list. Her name was Elena Mercer. She had grown up in the house across the street, the same house I had watched 100 times as a kid without ever having a good reason for watching it. She explained about the cast iron radiator inside my house, about the pressure latch on the old storm door, about 3 different people she had watched get locked out in the last 2 winters. She said it like she was reading from a list she had prepared, calm and practical. And when she was done, she just looked at me and waited. I said I'd leave it unlocked. She nodded like that was the right answer and turned to walk back across the street. I stood on my driveway holding a dish of soup, watching her go, and I had this strange feeling. Not the dizzy kind of feeling. Something quieter. Like a compass needle that had been spinning for years and had just, for one small moment, gone still. I went inside. I ate the soup standing at the kitchen counter because I hadn't uncovered the furniture yet. It was good soup. The kind that tastes like someone actually thought about it while they were making it. I left the door unlocked. The radiator kicked on at midnight and rattled the walls like something trapped inside the pipes was fighting to get out. I lay upstairs in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my parents' old room, and I thought about the woman across the street who had known exactly what I was in for before I did. I didn't sleep well, but for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't sure the sleeplessness was only about the war. She knocked at 6:15 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had been awake since 4, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and a legal pad, making a list of everything wrong with the house. The list had already filled one side of the page and was working its way down the other. The furnace, the roof, the bathroom tiles, the back porch, the kitchen faucet that dripped in a slow, steady rhythm that my brain kept trying to turn into Morse code. The water stain on the living room ceiling that had grown, I was fairly certain, since the night before. I heard the knock and every muscle in my back went tight before I could stop it. Then I remembered where I was. Crestfall, Ridgewood Lane, home or whatever this was. I opened the front door and Elena Mercer was standing on my porch holding 2 travel mugs, one in each hand, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt over a dark navy top, her boots already laced and clearly well used. Her dark hair was down today, loose and slightly wavy, different from the way she had worn it the evening before. She looked like someone who had already been awake for an hour and had done something useful with the time. She held out one of the mugs before I said a word. I asked her how she knew I'd be up. She said she didn't know for certain. She said she figured anyone who had spent years in the military probably wasn't sleeping past dawn on their first morning back in a house that sounded like a freight yard after midnight. I took the mug. It was the right thing to do. She looked past me into the hallway, taking in the stacked boxes and the dusty floors and the sheet-covered furniture, and her expression didn't change. No piti, no polite horror. Just the calm, steady look of someone doing a quiet calculation. She asked how bad it was inside. I told her she probably didn't want to know. She said she probably did. That was how she ended up sitting on the bottom step of my staircase at 6:30 in the morning, both hands wrapped around her travel mug, looking around at the work that needed doing like it was an interesting puzzle and not an overwhelming disaster. Most people would have said something kind and left. Elena asked me where I was planning to start. I told her I had been thinking about the living room, or the bathroom, or possibly all of it at once, which I knew even as I said it was not a real plan. She nodded slowly, like she was taking this seriously. Then she said, "Start with the room you'll spend the most time in. Let everything else wait." I had been awake since 4 in the morning making a 2-page list of problems, and somehow that one sentence cut straight through all of it. Start with the room you'll spend the most time in. It was so simple it almost made me feel foolish for not arriving at it myself. But that is the thing about being inside a problem. The bigger it gets, the harder it is to find the edges. We started in the living room. I pulled the sheets off the furniture and she helped me shift the heavier pieces into better positions without being asked. Neither of us felt the need to fill the silence with talking. That surprised me more than I expected. I had spent years in close quarters with people who never stopped talking, and I had grown so used to noise that silence usually made something under my skin go restless. But the quiet between Elena and me had no edges to it. It just sat there, easy and unbothered. Around mid-morning, we were pulling old trim off the hallway wall when she told me she had grown up in the house across the street, that her parents had moved to Florida a few years back and left it to her, that she had gone to college upstate, built a therapy practice in the city, and created the kind of life that looked correct from the outside. Then one morning she woke up and realized she had no idea what she was doing or who she was doing it for. So she came back to Crestfall. I asked if she missed it, the city. She thought about it for a real moment, long enough that I knew she wasn't reaching for the easy answer. Then she said she missed the anonymity sometimes, the feeling that nobody knew your business before you did. But she didn't miss being lonely in a room full of people. She said that was a worse kind of lonely than being alone outright. I knew exactly what she meant. I had felt it on every base, every temporary bunk, every apartment with thin walls and neighbors whose names I never learned. Surrounded and invisible at the same time, which is somehow quieter and heavier than actual solitude. She asked if I was planning to stay in Crestfall long-term. I told her I didn't know yet, that I was trying to figure out what long-term even looked like for me at this point in my life. She didn't push. She just nodded and went back to what she was doing. And something about that, the fact that she didn't need more from me than exactly what I had just given, settled something restless in my chest that had been moving for a very long time. By late afternoon, we had cleared the living room and made a real dent in the hallway. My hands were dusty and my knee was aching, and I had not thought once about the list on the legal pad. That alone felt significant. When you have spent years in a state of constant readiness, the ability to be fully inside one ordinary moment without part of your mind already moving toward the next threat is not a small thing. It is, in fact, a very large thing dressed up in quiet clothes. When Elena finally said she had to head back across the street, she paused at the front door. She said she'd come back tomorrow if I wanted an extra pair of hands. She said it the same way she said most things, like it cost her nothing, like showing up for someone was just a decision a person could make without needing a dramatic reason. I told her she didn't have to keep doing this. She looked at me for a steady moment. Then she said, "I know I don't have to. That's not why I'm doing it." She stepped off the porch and crossed the street, and I stood in the hallway listening to her footsteps fade on the pavement. I stayed there longer than made sense, turning what she had said over in my mind like something I had found on the ground and wasn't sure yet what to do with. I had spent so many years being careful about what people meant when they were kind that I had almost stopped being able to take a kind thing at face value. But something in the way Elena had said it made me believe her completely. She wasn't performing. She wasn't being polite. She was just telling me the truth in the direct and undecorated way she seemed to tell everything. I went back inside and looked at what the day had made of the living room. It wasn't finished. Not even close. But it looked different than it had that morning. It looked like a place in the middle of becoming something. I stood there in the dusty late light and realized I was actually looking forward to tomorrow. Not dreading it. Not bracing for it. Just looking forward to it. For a man who had spent 8 years waiting for the next hard thing, that was not a small shift. That was the whole ground moving. I almost didn't go. I stood next to my truck on a Friday afternoon with a half-packed bag and a head full of reasons this was a terrible idea. 2 days at a lake cabin. No broken walls to fix. No legal pad full of problems to solve. Just me, Elena, and whatever had been quietly growing between us that neither of us had been brave enough to put a name on yet. I threw the bag in the truck and drove before the reasonable part of my brain could win the argument. Elena was already outside when I pulled around front, loading a cooler into the back of her car with the easy confidence of someone who had done this 100 times. She looked up when she heard my engine and smiled, and I felt that pull in my chest again, the one I had been pretending wasn't there for 3 weeks. She was wearing dark jeans and a rust-colored sweater that suited the October trees around us perfectly. Her dark hair was down and loose. She looked completely like herself, which was the thing about Elena that kept catching me off guard. She never seemed to be playing a role for anyone else's benefit. We drove north for 2 hours through roads that twisted between trees wearing every shade of red and gold. She had the window cracked despite the cold, and the smell of damp leaves and open air filled the cab the whole way. She talked about her friend Kara, who owned the cabin, about how they had survived graduate school together, about how Kara always said Lake Keswick had a way of making people honest whether they were ready for it or not. I didn't say anything to that, but I heard it. The cabin appeared through a gap in the trees just before 5 o'clock. Small and weathered, an A-frame with cedar siding gone silver with age. A stone path cutting through the grass toward a narrow dock that stretched out over the water. Lake Keswick spread out beyond it, completely still, holding the whole sky in its surface like a mirror that had been lying there since the beginning of time. I stood at the end of the dock for a long moment without speaking. In the military, you learn to read landscapes for danger. You scan the horizon for movement. You notice what is wrong before it becomes a problem. It took me a few minutes just standing there to remember how to look at something and let it be beautiful without looking for the threat inside it. Elena appeared beside me and held out a flat stone without a word. I turned it over in my fingers, found the angle and sent it skipping. For hops. She watched it go, then found one for herself. 6 hops. She said nothing about it, which somehow made it worse in the best possible way. We carried our bags inside and settled into the cabin naturally, without discussion, The way you do with someone whose presence has already become familiar without you fully noticing it happen. She took the loft. I took the small bedroom at the back. We made pasta for dinner in a kitchen barely wide enough for 2 people, moved around each other without more than 2 collisions, and talked about nothing that mattered. Her most difficult houseplant. A road trip years ago that went wrong in every right way. Whether soup was a meal or just a warm drink with ambitions. I laughed more in that single hour than I had in months. After dinner we sat in front of the fireplace and watched the flames work through the wood while the lake went dark outside the windows. Elena had her knees pulled to her chest, watching the fire, and I was thinking about how strange it felt to be this comfortable somewhere, with someone, when she asked me a question I wasn't ready for. She asked if I ever thought about who I was before all of it. Before the uniform. Before everything. I looked at the fire for a long time. I told her I thought about that version of myself sometimes. The kid who had left Crestfall at 18, certain he was heading toward something worth the distance. I told her I wasn't sure I recognized him anymore, and I couldn't tell if that was grief or just time doing what time does to people whether they agree to it or not. Elena was quiet. Then she said she thought I was more like him than I realized. That I had just spent so long being needed for hard things that I had forgotten I was allowed to simply exist without earning it. I didn't have an answer for that, so I let it sit between us in the warm air. We pulled out the fold-down couch late and lay on opposite sides of it with the fire burning itself down to coals. The cabin was warm. The lake was silent. I stared at the ceiling and told her the thing I had been carrying for weeks without meaning to carry it. That I had a history of pulling back just far enough for people to eventually stop reaching. That I could feel myself starting to do it again and didn't know how to stop without someone noticing the distance first. Elena didn't rush to fix it. She let me finish completely. Then she told me about a man she had spent 3 years with who had slowly convinced her that her feelings were too large, her needs too present, her personality too much of itself. When he left he told her she was the problem. She said she had believed him for a long time after that. She said she wasn't doing that again. Borrowing someone else's version of who she was. I said quietly, "For what it's worth, you are not too much." She said, "I know that now. But it lands differently when someone else says it out loud." She reached across the space between us and found my hand in the dark. She didn't say anything else and she didn't need to. I held on, and something that had been pulled tight across my chest for longer than I could accurately measure slowly loosened its grip. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke to pale gray light coming off the water. The fire was cold ash. The cabin was still. Elena was curled against my side, breathing slow and steady, her hands still loosely wrapped around mine. I lay there and watched the light move across the ceiling. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't run through the list. I didn't brace myself for whatever came next. I just lay there in the quiet and let the morning be what it was. We pulled back onto Ridgewood Lane late Sunday afternoon with the easy quiet of 2 people still carrying a good weekend carefully, the way you carry something you don't want to spill. I parked at the curb and we were just climbing out when I noticed the car. A black sedan, expensive and deliberate, parked directly in front of Elena's house. The man leaning against it straightened up the moment he saw us come around the front of the truck. Tall, well-dressed, the kind of posture that said he was used to being the most significant person in any room he walked into. Elena went very still beside me. "That's Marcus," she said. Her voice had gone flat and careful in a way I recognized as something practiced over time. She looked at me once, gathering herself the way I had watched her do with difficult things, from the inside out, quietly and without asking for help. She said she needed to handle it herself. I told her I would be right there. She crossed the street. I stayed on my side, close enough to watch, far enough to give her the space she had asked for. Marcus talked too much and stood too close. Elena kept her arms crossed and her feet planted. She shook her head twice. She pointed toward his car. He smiled the entire time. Like her answers were moves in a game she hadn't realized they were playing. He got in the car and drove away. Elena stood alone on her front walk for a moment before going inside without looking back. I thought that was the end of it. 2 days later I was pulling weeds in the backyard when I heard a car door slam out front. I came around the side of the house in time to see Marcus walking up Elena's front path like he owned the entire street. Elena came out before he knocked. She had seen him coming and chosen her own terms. I noticed that and filed it away. This time the conversation was louder. I could hear pieces of it from across the road. His voice had the sharp, controlled edge of someone performing calmness very deliberately. I heard her name used twice. I heard the word mistake more than once. I heard him tell her she wasn't thinking clearly, which is a thing people say when they mean that the other person is thinking clearly but reaching different conclusions. Then he reached out and grabbed her arm. Not violently, but with enough grip that she had to pull back. And the way she pulled back, that practiced, tired motion, told me everything I needed to know about how many times that particular move had been used before. I crossed the street in 4 strides. I stepped between them and looked at Marcus and said, very quietly, that she had asked him to leave once already, and that this was the last time anyone was going to phrase it politely. He tried the easy smile. A comment about the new neighbor playing a role he hadn't been cast for. I didn't move. I didn't respond to it. I stood there and waited until he understood that the smile had no effect on me whatsoever. He took a step back. He looked at Elena. Whatever he saw in her face finished the conversation. He said something low and pointed that was meant only for her. Then he walked to his car, and this time when he left he drove like someone who understood the door had closed. The street went quiet. Elena let out a long, slow breath and her shoulders dropped from somewhere up near her ears. She looked exhausted in the particular way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with years of managing someone who required constant management. I asked if she was all right. She said she would be. Then she turned to me with something careful and serious in her expression, and I could tell she had chosen what came next very deliberately. She said she needed me to understand something, that she didn't need saving, that she had just handled her own situation. What she needed from me was a partner, someone who trusted her to carry her own weight but who showed up close enough that she knew she wasn't carrying it alone. I told her that was exactly what I had been trying to do. She nodded slowly. Then she said she wasn't interested in being protected from her own life. She was interested in sharing it with someone. I let those words settle over me like something solid and true. We stood there on her front path while the late afternoon light came long and golden through the maple trees, and I thought about what she had just described. Not rescue, not control dressed up as care. Just 2 people standing close enough to matter without taking over each other's ground. I understood that completely. More than I expected to. More, maybe, than I had ever understood anything. I turned down the contract on a Monday morning and for the first time in years, saying no felt like the most honest thing I had done. The recruiter went quiet for a moment. Then he reminded me about the salary, the title, the trajectory, everything the offer was supposed to mean to someone like me. I told him I was sure. He said he hoped I knew what I was walking away from. I thanked him and hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and waited for regret to show up. It never came. What arrived instead was something I didn't have a good word for at first. A lightness, like a coat I had been wearing so long I had forgotten it had weight until the moment I took it off. I sat there in the morning quiet and thought about the man who had driven back to Crestfall 8 weeks earlier with 2 duffel bags and a house full of dust. And I barely recognized him. But here is the part nobody warns you about when you finally say no to the wrong thing. You still have to build something to say yes to, and I had no clear map for that part. I spent the first week after that phone call walking through the house, room by room, looking at what I had repaired over the past 2 months. The patched walls, the replaced tiles, the back porch boards I had sanded and renailed one at a time, the faucet that no longer dripped its slow, counting rhythm into the kitchen sink. I had been fixing things my whole life. The military had sharpened that into something close to instinct. Maybe the answer was closer to that than anything the recruiter had been offering. It was Elena who pointed me toward the position at the Veterans Rehabilitation Center. She mentioned it one evening while we were washing dishes after dinner, slipping it into the conversation the way she said most things, without ceremony, without pressure. She had seen the posting and thought it sounded like something I would be good at. She said it like she was passing along a note someone had left on a counter. But underneath the casualness was a certainty that I felt more than heard. She wasn't guessing. She had been paying attention to who I actually was, not who I had been before I left, not the worn-down version that had kicked open a stuck front door 8 weeks ago. Who I was right now. I sent in the application before I went to bed that night. The interview was on a Thursday. I drove across Crestfall to the rehabilitation center, which sat at the edge of town behind a row of oak trees shedding their last leaves. The building was older than I expected. The floors creaked in certain hallways. A few ceiling tiles told stories about deferred repairs. I recognized every problem the moment I saw it. I had fixed worse. The director was a man named Harris, a former field medic who had done 2 rotations in places whose names made the air in the room go slightly different when he said them. He shook my hand, looked at my service record for a long moment, then looked up and said he had been trying to fill the role for 5 months. By the end of the hour, he was walking me through the maintenance wing and introducing me to the crew. He offered me the position before I had made it back to the parking lot. I sat in my truck under those oak trees and didn't start the engine for a while. I thought about every road that had led to that parking lot. The deployments, the years of sleeping in places without real names, the long drive back to Crestfall, the cracked driveway and the peeling paint and the woman across the street who had shown up with soup on my first night back and told me not to lock my door. None of it had felt like it was going somewhere while it was happening. But sitting there under those trees, I started to think it had been going somewhere the whole time, just not anywhere I could have pointed to on a map. I started the following Monday. The work was exactly what I needed. A broken boiler in the east wing. A storage room that flooded every time it rained because a drain had been ignored for 2 years. A faulty electrical panel that had 3 separate work orders attached to it and 0 repairs. My crew was a group of experienced men who had watched administrators come and go and were not in the habit of being impressed by new faces. I didn't need them to be impressed. I showed up early. I stayed late when the work required it. I learned their names before I expected them to learn mine. The oldest man on the crew was Walt, 23 years at that facility. He had a look he gave newcomers, patient and slightly tired, that said he was simply waiting to see how long this one would last. He stopped giving me that look on a Tuesday afternoon when I crawled under a utility sink to fix a pipe that had been leaking for 7 months because nobody had gotten low enough to actually reach it. When I came out with grease on my shirt and the problem solved, Walt looked at me for a moment and nodded slowly. One nod. That was enough. Outside of work, something between Elena and me had stopped being something we could politely ignore. After the weekend at Lake Keswick and the afternoon with Marcus on the front walk, there was no longer any reasonable way to pretend we were simply 2 neighbors who shared coffee and house repairs. Whatever it was had a shape now, even if we hadn't handed it a name yet. She would come over after her last client call of the day. We would make dinner or sit on the porch or work on whatever corner of the house needed attention that week. We talked about everything. Her therapy practice, which was growing steadily. My new job. The town. Our pasts. The things we had gotten wrong and the ones we were still working out. One evening in late November she told me about a patient she couldn't stop thinking about, a veteran in his 50s who had come to her practice after 20 years of silence, and the way she talked about her work made something in me go very quiet and very attentive at the same time. She was gifted in a way that was hard to describe. She could make a person feel completely seen without making them feel exposed. I had experienced it myself without realizing it had a name. We hit our first real wall about 6 weeks after she moved in. It was not loud. There was no argument, no door slammed, no dramatic moment that announced itself. It was a quiet Tuesday dinner where she set down her fork and told me calmly that she sometimes felt like she was talking to a wall. She said it without cruelty, the way someone speaks when they respect you enough to tell the truth rather than quietly start pulling away. That landed harder than any argument would have. I had a habit of going silent when something bothered me, shutting down, going through the motions, waiting for whatever I was feeling to pass on its own without anyone having to know it had been there. It was something I had learned without choosing to learn it, years of environments where there was no time and no space to process anything out loud, and it had followed me home like a stowaway I hadn't thought to check for. I sat with what she had said. I didn't defend myself, though part of me wanted to. I thought about every person I had gone quiet on and what it had cost both of us. Then I told her she was right. I told her where the habit came from. I told her I wanted to work on it, not as a promise I was handing her, but as something I actually meant for my own sake as much as hers. She reached across the table and took my hand.
No lecture.
No conditions attached. Just two people deciding to understand each other rather than keep score. That one honest conversation did more for us than 100 easy evenings could have, because real closeness isn't built in the good moments. It's built in the ones where you choose to stay present instead of disappearing into yourself. Spring came late that year. Cold held on longer than it had any right to, but by April the yard was green again, and I had started rebuilding the back porch in the evenings after work, replacing soft boards one by one, sanding each one smooth before it went down. Elena would sit out there with a book while I worked, and sometimes we talked, and sometimes we were just quiet in the same space. There is a specific kind of peace in being quiet with someone and not needing to fill it. I had never had that before. I did not take it lightly. I had been carrying the ring since May. I bought it one Wednesday on my lunch break from a small shop 2 towns over. A simple band with a single stone that caught light in a clean, straightforward way. The kind of ring that says something true without trying to say too much. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket and kept it there, not waiting for a planned moment, just waiting for the right one. Found me on an evening in August. We were sitting on the porch swing after dinner. The sky was going pink and deep orange above the tree line. Elena had her head on my shoulder, her eyes half closed, completely at ease. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block a dog was barking at absolutely nothing. It was an ordinary evening in every possible way. And it was perfect because of that, not in spite of it. I reached into my jacket pocket. I slid off the swing and onto one knee on the porch boards, and she sat up slowly, her eyes going wide and still in the evening light. I told her I had come back to Crestfall not knowing who I was anymore. That I had walked onto Ridgewood Lane with 2 bags and a house full of dust and no real idea what came next. I told her she had shown me something I had stopped believing was possible. That you could build a real, quiet, steady life without performing a version of yourself for anyone else's benefit. I told her she made me want to be honest. She made me want to stay. Then I asked her to marry me. She pressed one hand over her mouth. Her eyes were bright and full and completely present. The whole street seemed to hold its breath alongside me. Then she said yes. Completely, immediately, without a single condition attached. I put the ring on her finger and stood up, and she wrapped both arms around me and held on the way you hold something you have been moving toward for a long time without letting yourself fully believe you would arrive. We stood on that porch while the last of the light left the sky, on the same street where she had first watched me from her doorway the afternoon I came home, and I thought about a neighbor who had once told me not to lock my door on my very first night back. At the time I thought she was talking about the radiator. She was talking about something much larger than that. And somewhere between the soup and the swing set and the quiet Tuesday dinners and the one honest conversation that mattered more than 100 easy ones, I had finally understood what it was. Home is not the place you were born. It is not the house with your name on the deed or the town you grew up in or the street you learned to ride a bike on. Home is the person sitting next to you who already knows the hard parts and chose to stay anyway. I had come back from war looking for somewhere to land. I hadn't expected to find someone worth landing for.